Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is well and that you have had an extraordinary week wherever you are. Before we begin, I'd like to give my usual thanks to the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the art that he has produced for this series, post-reclamation, and I'm also going to give a thank you to my Patreons for their continued financial pledge. It is much appreciated. I'm also going to mention the Tales of the Hunger Games Discord, where pretty much everything to do with this series is discussed, along with the general Hunger Games Discord, where tales are created based on your choices. An extra link that I'm going to mention this week is also a video created by RENE. I know you might say your channel name differently, but it is basically an amalgamation of various symbols that have been created based on these games and various logos that are linked to characters, years of the games, famous deaths, hazards. I really enjoyed watching this video and seeing some of the things that people take from each games each year. So feel free to have a check of that. All three of those links are in the description, along with plenty of other links that are associated with this series, so have a cheeky browse down there if you feel like it. Also, you might have noticed that these games have come on Tuesday. Now, here we have the schedule that is upcoming. I did say with the previous schedule that it might change, and lo and behold, it has. Basically, next week on the Tuesday as well is going to be District 7's games. Then I'm going to be taking a week off. Then we're back to Monday, District 654, week off, District 321, week off. The big showdown, grand finale, then takes place on the 23rd August, 24th and 25th. Right, enough of me rabbling on. Well, about that, without further ado, let's go. Following the spectacular show that was District 9's games, many capital citizens were excited beyond words for District 8's games, with some speculating about the kind of arena that would be used for this district, whilst others theorised how its tributes would fight differently compared to past years. After a week of festivities within the capital, Drin Green, male victor of District 9's games, arrived in District 8 on the Monday for its reaping. Under the orders of President Gul, Tritica MacDonald, female victor of District 9's games, did not attend this reaping, but instead remained in the Gul hospital. Drin was given a tour of District 8 by Mayor Batista, although several factories and public buildings that are usually featured in the Victor's tour were not able to be shown due to the damage that radicals of this district had inflicted onto these buildings over the past week. The peacekeepers also had to guide this tour very carefully in order to avoid groups of these radicals that were shouting obscenities on their way to the reaping, but after a few delays, Drin and Mayor Batista eventually arrived back in the reaping square. As Drin spoke to some of the district officials, the reaping was delayed even further, due to the heightened security checks of the youths that were entering the square that were ordered by President Gul in order to avoid a repeat of the events at the end of District 9's reaping. Furthermore, several youths were allegedly acting in a rebellious manner, which caused the peacekeepers to threaten them with their guns, although fortunately no shots needed to be fired at this time. Once all the purple-clad youths were finally in place, a brief film was shown, in order to remind the district citizens about the consequences of their wrongdoings. A few youths needed to be hit with their peacekeepers' guns for speaking and giving three-finger salutes during this film, but fortunately, there was no major outburst from the enclosures during this time. Once the film was over, Drin was prompted by Mayor Batista to choose a name for the female reaping bowl, and he subsequently picked out a name that he revealed to be 17-year-old Nett Charles. A shrill wail was heard almost immediately from near the back of the enclosure, and the camera swiftly panned in on a scant young lady with short and wiry brown hair. As peacekeepers pulled Nett into the aisle, her tatty purple dress became visible, and Eugenia Ravenstill commented that she could have made an effort, whilst Rubius Dalton, victor of the 86th Hunger Games, laughed at Nett's reluctant walk towards the platform, before joking that the other tributes would probably kill her before the games for having made this noise when she was reaped. Once Nett was on the platform, she very timidly shook hands with Drin, and then he chose a male name. Rayon, aged 16, was the first male to be reaped, and he snarled as he walked onto the platform, before refusing to shake Drin's hand at first, which caused a rather uncomfortable silence, but he eventually did so after being butted by a peacekeeper's gun. Bernina, aged 14, was the next female reaped, and as she entered the aisle, she tried to run away from the platform, but she was then caught easily and dragged back by peacekeepers, which caused amusement to capital audiences. The next male tribute to be reaped was 18-year-old Bark Berjac, and the camera found a young man with dark skin and hair, who was clearly unenthusiastic about this choice, but he walked to the platform without prompting from the peacekeepers. Eugenia joked that he looked a little like Rubius, but whilst no reply was heard to this comment, she marvelled at Bark's deconstructed purple suit that hardly covered his arms, and therefore allowed the size of his muscles to be seen. After Bark strutted onto the platform and shook hands with Drin, the next female tribute was revealed to be 17-year-old Lacey Zhao. The camera swiftly found a shocked young lady, whose mouth had just fallen open, but as the peacekeepers entered the enclosure to take her, Eugenia spoke about how nicely Lacey's jet black hair flowed into her purple dress beneath. Whilst walking to the platform, Lacey seemed ready to cry, but continued to walk down the aisle, and when she was close enough, she seemed to smile at Bark, who returned the expression. She also looked with curiosity at Bernina, aged 14, and Net, aged 17, who was still crying quietly to her right, before facing back towards the crowd with a limited expression, whilst a stocky young man named Synth, aged 17, was reaped and escorted to the platform. The next tributes to be reaped were Chenille, aged 18, who Eugenia noted to have the most presence of any of the female tributes thus far, although when Jacquard, aged 15, was chosen next, Rubius stated that this one could not have less presence, most likely due to his fearful demeanour as he approached the platform. Therma, aged 17, on the other hand, caused a commotion by pushing back against a peacekeeper as he escorted her into the aisle, but when he pushed his gun into the back of her head, she suddenly seemed to remember herself before quietly walking to the platform. The next male tribute was announced to be 18-year-old Zig Casino. The camera soon found a quizzical-looking young man with curly blonde hair, who was stood in the furthest corner of the enclosure. Although he was not heard, Zig was seen to swear in frustration as he walked to the aisle, to which Eugenia jokingly commented, "Naughty." She then praised Zig for his finely embroidered purple suit, although Rubius replied that there was no way he had made this himself. After shaking Drin's hand, Zig was noticed to share a look of reassurance with Bark, and Eugenia stated that if these two were indeed friends, they could create a worthy alliance, to which Rubius replied that only one of them can win, but Eugenia maintained her enthusiasm by excitedly saying how much she loved the games this year. The next female reaped was Ola, aged 15, who seemed unable to stop coughing while she was stood on the platform, to which Rubius commented that this would soon become annoying for the other tributes. The following male reaped was Pelon, aged 15, who only had one eye, and Eugenia joked that he might have trouble keeping an eye on the other tributes, which triggered groans in Snow Square. After him was Velveteen, aged 13, who was so brittle and thin that bones in her arms were visible through her skin. The next tribute was then revealed to be 12-year-old Gingham Tallet, and a human crater swiftly formed around a boy with long brown hair and oversized clothes, who after a closer analysis was revealed to be the shortest in the entire enclosure. Whilst the peacekeepers came to collect Gingham, Rubius joked that his long hair probably had more potential than Gingham himself. He snivelled as he walked to the platform, before looking in fear at Pelon, aged 15, whilst Drin chose the last female tribute, who he announced to be 14-year-old Organza Artrak. Whilst Eugenia wondered out loud if the last reaped tributes would act differently to the others, the camera found a finely dressed young lady with perfectly plaited brown hair, which swayed gently over her puffy violet dress as she walked down the aisle. Rubius said that there was no way Organza had made this dress, but as she approached the platform and confidently swayed her arms, Eugenia said that maybe she had made it. Whilst Organza shook hands with Drin, Hancock, aged 18, was the last male tribute to be reaped, and he walked towards the platform with a dazed and hopeless expression. As he shook hands with Drin, the peacekeeper quickly dragged all the other tributes into the town hall that lay behind, most likely in order to stop them from doing anything inappropriate in front of the crowds. Despite a few indignant murmurs from Bernina, aged 14, Jacquard, aged 15, and Gingham, aged 12, the tributes were soon placed within the confines of the town hall without further incident. Following their departure, the remaining population were ordered to stay in the reaping square. Unfortunately, violent and unruly behaviour soon began towards the peacekeepers, which caused 2 of them and 67 local citizens to be killed, along with countless more injuries. However, the tributes were unaware of this, as they were already being driven to the station. Whilst they were escorted onto the train by peacekeepers, Rayon, aged 16, and Therma, aged 17, each tried to fight back, but they were swiftly subdued and forced into the dining carriage, along with the other tributes. As the train started to move through District 8, the The peacekeepers ordered the two Avoxes present to close the blinds and play Horn of Plenty, as was procedure by now. The Avoxes did as they were ordered, and most tributes simply sat and waited in the darkness as the train picked up speed. Yet after exactly 4 minutes, the Avox by the window looked around the blind, and as a peacekeeper ordered him to step back, the other Avox paused the anthem, whilst the Avox by the window suddenly pulled up the blind. Most tributes then watched in shock as the peacekeepers pulled out their guns, but the Avoxes continued to grin and disobey these orders. A peacekeeper shot the Avox by the window, and as he collapsed to the ground, another peacekeeper ran to close the blind, but it was too late, as the train passed a factory that had a large painting of the Unidad symbol painted across its side. Although many tributes shouted in shock at this shooting, it is reported that most of them appeared to see the symbol on the side of the factory as well, but as Rayon jumped up and pointed at it, he was knocked out by the gun barrel of a passing peacekeeper. The blind was finally pulled down with such force that it almost ripped off, and the other peacekeepers held their guns to face the tributes, whilst the Avoxes were dragged out of the carriage. Soon after, the train passed through the outskirts of District 8, and both Avoxes were thrown from the train, allegedly hitting their heads against a large rock. With no Avoxes present on the train, the only testaments we have of the journey are from the cameras in the carriage, but due to the sound never being recovered from any cameras that formerly belonged to the capital, it is unknown what any tribute or peacekeeper said until they arrived in the capital. Like most tributes, Net, aged 17, was clearly shaken by what she had seen during the start of the journey, but once the peacekeepers kindly allowed tributes to walk around, she headed over to one of the bookcases in the corner of the carriage and spent almost the entire journey reading a dusty old book about meteorological changes, whilst keeping to herself and not speaking to any other tributes. Bark and Zig, both aged 18, quickly found each other and made their way to the bar, where they sat at the table near to Therma, aged 17, who was already halfway through a bottle of whiskey. The boys were then seen to speak to each other for a few minutes, before being joined by Lacey, aged 17, who was later revealed to be the friend of Bark's girlfriend, Luma. He then introduced Lacey to Zig, and the trio appeared to enjoy the next few hours drinking and talking about the other tributes, whilst occasionally looking around at Therma, who became more and more inebriated as the journey continued, which greatly amused Zig. Lacey also noticed that Pelon, aged 15, and Bernina, aged 14, were sat within the middle of the carriage, and looking at and discussing them, but while she appeared to encourage Bark and Zig to join her in order to confront this pair, Bark seemed to reassure her that it was not worth the effort. As for Gingham, aged 12, he at first sat alone in a corner near Net, who completely ignored him. Yet as the journey continued, he seemed to set his sights on Chenille, aged 18, who was stretching her body in a rather unusual manner next to a central sofa. Gingham approached her, and seemed to be asking for something, but she practically ignored him, before becoming rather angry when he would not leave, which caused the peacekeepers to intervene. Gingham was then ordered to move to the other side of the carriage, and after crying a little, he spoke to Ola, aged 15, and although she did speak with him to some degree, she was clearly struggling to hold a conversation through her continuous coughing fits. As for Organza, aged 14, she had initially tried to speak to Jacquard, aged 15, but he did not seem to offer much conversation in return, and after a while she left the sofa next to him, before heading to another sofa near the bookcases, where she proceeded to sleep for most of the journey. 1 hour before the train was due to arrive in the capital, Ava Berwick, victor of the 81st Hunger Games, entered the carriage and demanded all tributes focus. It is unknown what she said, but most tributes appear to be paying diligent attention, and judging by her usual mentoring style, it is likely that Ava was introducing herself and welcoming the tributes. However, she seemed to stop this speech when Therma slumped off her chair, and shortly after she hit the ground, Ava quickly pulled her up and grabbed some water for her, before signalling to the peacekeepers through the door. They quickly came in and dragged Therma out, but the tribute's attention was soon diverted to the buffet that was being wheeled into the other end of the carriage, which caused most tributes to marvel at the amount and variety of foods present. Velveteen, aged 13, even fainted, with Hancock, aged 18, later remarking that one could hear several bones cracking as she hit the floor, although most of the other tributes paid her no attention, before quickly lining up by this buffet. Ava walked through the aisle and appeared to check on the tributes as they ate. Then when each of them had finished, she sat down and spoke to them in small groups or individually. One of the first pairs that she approached were Net and Synth, both aged 17, who were sat near the bookcases, where they had begun to speak during their meal, and Ava seemed interested in what they both had to say. She then seemed ready to approach Bark, Lacey, and Zig, although the latter appeared to be laughing and pointing at the chair where Thurma had been drinking, which caused Ava to have a stern word with him. Many other tributes were looking at the pair during this time, but within 3 seconds of Zig laughing at Ava, she had placed him in a headlock, which appeared to amuse Gingham. Organza was one of the last tributes to whom Ava spoke, shortly before they were due to arrive in the capital. Although Ava seemed to be talking in a serious tone, Organza was clearly becoming distracted by the floral hues on Ava's dress, and within minutes, she was showing Ava illustrations from a copy of Anderson fashion, and presumably the styles of clothing that she wanted to wear for the parade. A few minutes later, the train arrived in Snow Station, and the tributes were placed in the blacked-out limousines that drove them straight to the accommodation tower. They were then taken into the main hallway and told by Ava to choose a cohabitant of the opposite gender. A swift scurry followed, before the established pairs were escorted into the lift by the A-boxes and taken to their apartments. Net and Synth were placed together in apartment 1, where Synth spent most of the afternoon watching past games, including that of Ava, whilst Net relaxed on the balcony. Although she appeared to be reading, it was noticed during later camera analysis that she seemed to keep the book open on the same page for most of this time, with some historians believing that she was instead focusing on the argument that was occurring between Chanel and Jacquard on the balcony above. After their dinner, Ava came to speak to each pair of tributes, but unlike the other mentors so far, she asked for them to have these conversations on the balcony, which were therefore not heard by the A-boxes present, but the cameras showed that Net and Synth both remained calm and relatively inanimate throughout this conversation. As Ava left, she also appeared to point at the moon and the sky and make several comments, although it is unknown what these were. In apartment 4 were Bark and Lacey, who spent most of the afternoon discussing the other tributes, whilst exercising in the main room. Lacey also practiced her sewing skills by using a needle that she had hidden in her hair, although within minutes, peacekeepers entered the apartment and confiscated this needle, which later caused an investigation to be launched regarding how Lacey had managed to bring this needle so far without it being noticed. After their dinner, Ava spoke to the pair, and several expert lip readers believed that she was often mentioning Zig, whilst Bark and Lacey seemed to show rather different reactions whenever his name was mentioned. Gingham and Organza were put together in apartment 6. Neither of the pair spoke very much at first, but after a while of watching Capital TV, they seemed to find some topics to discuss, and by the evening, the pair were talking much more, even joking about some of the popular fashions in the capital. Ava came to visit them later, and she was surprised to see that this apartment's A-box was already on the balcony, while seeming to communicate with someone on the ground, so she dismissed him inside. It is unknown what she discussed with Gingham and Organza, but Gingham was noted to be crying towards the end of their conversation, and so Ava comforted him. As for Zig, he was placed with Ola in apartment 7. She seemed to avoid him as much as possible, and eventually decided to settle in her bedroom, where Zig was not allowed to go. He spent most of his time in the main room, before heading to the balcony, where the A-box was standing. Even though Zig was apparently aware that they were not allowed to communicate, he asked questions to the A-box and tried to receive a reaction, but failed in this regard. Yet after appearing to become bored with the lack of interaction from the A-box, Zig began to speak to him in an inappropriate manner, and he made several jokes that would now be deemed as Ava-phobic. The A-box soon lost his temper and punched Zig's face, which caused a fight to start, although upon hearing this commotion from the corridor, peacekeepers sprinted into the apartment and broke up the fight. However, during the scuffle, the A-box was accidentally knocked over the balcony. The peacekeepers then acted very quickly to remove the A-box's body and clean the ground below. However, footage of this incident had in fact been filmed from a nearby building by an unidentified capital citizen, who was later revealed to be a part of a Unidad sleeper cell. The footage was then enhanced and edited to show the A-box being restrained by 2 peacekeepers, then punching one of them, before the other pushed the A-box off the balcony. Capital TV was illegally hacked 1 hour later, and this footage was aired during a review of District 9's games, with the rather morbid sentence, "For those without a voice," written along the bottom of the screen as the A-box fell. Although capital authorities swiftly denied the outrageous rumours that the A-box was purposefully thrown over the balcony, some citizens still did not believe what had been said, with many families allegedly stopping their A-boxes from leaving their homes, in case they were killed by peacekeepers. The next morning, the training was ordered to go ahead as normal, with the tributes seemingly unaware of the controversy that had just taken place. After arriving in the training centre, they were spoken to in a stern manner by Rubius, and the training began. Gingham initially seemed rather lost within the stations and intimidated by some of the skills that were being shown, especially from Zig and Lacey, who were quickly improving their accuracy in the archery station. Yet after appearing to notice Rubeus glaring at him, and then Ava mouthing at him to do something, Gingham looked to the axe-throwing station on his left, where Jacquard was pensively trying to improve his aim. Gingham approached and asked if he could join, to which Jacquard enthusiastically agreed, and over the next few hours, the boys threw these axes with as much accuracy as they could muster. Although neither of them were initially very strong in this station, they helped each other and greatly improved their skills as the time went by, whilst discussing their lives back in District 8, and occasionally taking breaks to look at the other tributes. It was also noticed that they even helped Ola to her feet after she fell and sprained her ankle on the obstacle course. As for Organza, she practiced in a few different stations, without much success, until she eventually settled in the fabric station, where she stayed for the rest of the morning. She seemed to keep to herself and soon started knitting a large shawl from a mixture of pink and purple fabrics, without paying attention to any other tributes, although she seemed to notice that Velveteen was watching her. This also appeared to arouse the interest of Bernina and Pellon, who were swimming in the nearby aquatic station, and they seemed to debate why Organza was making this shawl. Meanwhile, Bark and Lacey began the morning by practicing with Zig in their archery station. However, they only took individual turns practicing with the bow and arrow, whilst the other two intently watched Chanil in the neighbouring spear station, which appeared to distract her, and after just 10 minutes, she moved to the toxicological station on the other side of the training centre. The trio then practiced together and greatly improved their skills for the next hour. After this hour, they moved to the survival station, where Lacey created a shelter and Bark and Zig eventually managed to start a fire between them. During this time, Bark also appeared to notice that Pellon was watching them from the camouflage station, but just as he looked ready to mention this to his allies, Zig laughed and asked why Jacquard and Gingham were working in the axe station, when it was obvious that these weapons would be reserved for District 7's games. Finally, the trio moved to the main obstacle course, where Ola was struggling across the monkey bars. Yet as she turned around and saw them watching her, she appeared to become fearful, and fell to the ground, which hurt her ankle, although Gingham and Jacquard swiftly helped her away. Bark, Zig, and Lacey then performed extremely well in this station, and whilst Lacey easily set the best female time for this district, Bark and Zig desperately tried to outdo each other, with Zig eventually scoring the best male time for the district. As for Net, she practiced a little at first in the survival station, but after appearing to realise that her efforts at creating a shelter were futile, she moved to the plant identification station. Although some tributes gave her strange looks for practicing there, she appeared too engrossed in the station to notice, and after a while she was able to identify almost every single plant that was listed. However, towards the end of the training, Rubeus approached Net and ordered her to practice in the fencing station with Rayon, who was already being dressed in the appropriate pads by other training staff. Although Net claimed to have never held a sword in her life, she allowed the training staff to dress her for the occasion, and she began to spar with Rayon. Many other tributes watched, whilst neither of the pair were showing great techniques, and many careless points were being given away to each other. Rayon soon gained the upper hand, and he laughed as Net lost more and more energy, whilst goading her and looking around at the other tributes' reactions. When it was time for the final point, Net and Rayon were once again moved to the opposite ends of the fencing walk, but just as Rubeus was about to tell them to begin, Rayon made an inappropriate physical gesture towards Net, which seemed to anger her so much that she grabbed a small knife from an adjacent table, which she threw straight at Rayon's groin. He gasped and fell backwards, whilst Net also gasped and immediately apologised, and the other tributes watched in shock and wonder, but fortunately for Rayon, he was wearing a protective groin cup, which prevented any injury. Net was then pulled away by training staff, and although she was not punished physically, she was heavily reprimanded by both Rubeus and Ava. The rest of the training continued relatively uneventfully, but towards the end, Organza finished making her shawl. Yet when she was told that she could not take it with her at the end of training, she became upset and shouted with such aggression at the training staff that Rubeus tasered her in the back. Whilst most tributes and training staff watched on once more, Hancock ran over and jumped onto Rubeus' back, which resulted in a scuffle between the two that was swiftly ended by other training staff, who tasered Hancock in the stomach. Ava then ran in and stood between Rubeus and Hancock, who was now on the floor, and after desperately convincing Rubeus that Hancock had learned his lesson, he eventually walked away, whilst Hancock passed out. Unlike previous weeks of these district games, the tributes were ordered to create their own outfits for the interviews, and so that afternoon saw them busily constructing their suits and dresses from the reams of purple fabrics that were provided to each apartment. The interviews began at sundown, with Eugenia merrily welcoming both the citizens in the audience, along with the citizens throughout the capital and districts, before prompting applause for Ava, who had designed the studio's decorations for the evening, including the luminous purple lighting, along with the matching translucent silk that was draped over the runway and walls. As the spotlight found Ava, she waved graciously amidst waves of applause, and the interview swiftly began. After a few questions to her fellow judges, Rubius Dalton and game maker Artulia Fling, Eugenia welcomed the first tribute, Net, who was adorned in a basic yet presentable purple lame dress, along with a small violet rose fascinator. She opted to show her plant identification skills for her chosen skill, which was done well, although it was clear that the judges and audience members alike were rather confused as to how this would be a useful skill in the games. Rubius asked this question to Net when she had finished, to which she responded that one would never know if there could be useful plants in the arena, but Rubius did not seem convinced. She was then asked some more questions about her outfit by Eugenia, along with some questions by Artulia regarding how she would handle potential hazards, to which Net gave some good ideas, but she failed to make much of an impression and scored 3-3-4, according to the judgment of Eugenia, Rubius and Artulia, which gave her an overall score of 3. After Rayon and Bernina's rather bland interviews followed, it was Bark's turn, and he immediately impressed the crowd by coming to the stage in a purple leather suit that was slightly too tight, but hence rather revealing. Eugenia made no effort to hide her admiration for both Bark and his looks, until Rubius joked that it was best that he did something else to distract her. Bark therefore threw a set of knives at several targets on a wall, and despite not hitting every single target, he was extremely accurate, only missing by a few inches here and there. The questioning followed, and Bark became a little hesitant when Artulia asked how he would deal with adverse weather, but Rubius quipped that a knife can save you from anything, and as the crowd cheered, Eugenia said that if Bark made it to the grand final, he would likely receive a ton of sponsor gifts. He was then scored 7-6-6, which scored him 6 overall. The next interview was that of Lacey, whose flowing velvet dress was well received by the audience. She decided to shoot arrows at a variety of targets that suddenly lit up on the wall, and like Bark, she performed well, only missing a few targets by a matter of inches. However, Lacey clearly struggled during the questioning, and suddenly became rather shy compared to how she had been throughout this week, especially when she was asked how she could be sure to trust Bark and Zig. The scores were then given as 6-5-4, which gave Lacey an overall score of 5. The next 4 interviews went by relatively uneventfully, except for that of Synth, whose impressive display of strength helped him tie with Bark for the best score of 6. It was then Zig's turn, and he came to the stage with a daring smile, dressed in a well-fitted white shirt and purple braces and trousers that received respectful applause from the audience. For his chosen skill, Zig avoided holograms that came out of a side screen, which he slashed with a sword. He was only hit by one hologram, and received cheers from the audience, before bowing and twirling his sword like a cane. Although Eugenia and Artulia both seemed impressed by this display, Rubius did not seem so enthused, and he began the questioning by asking why Zig joked about everything. This seemed to surprise Eugenia, Artulia, and the audience, but Zig suddenly became rather serious, and stated that he knew he was likely to die, and so he wanted to have some fun before the end. This declaration received a mixture of reactions from the audience, and after a few fairly decently answered questions, Zig was given scores of 5-4-5, which scored him 5 overall. Apart from Ola wearing what Eugenia described as the ugliest dress in the history of Panem, the next 3 interviews went by without incident, and then it was the turn of Gingham, who came to the stage in a basic purple suit, but he also seemed to surprise the audience with his newly cut hair. He then surprised them further by choosing to throw axes for his skill. At first he was clearly having trouble, and Rubius held his head in his hands with embarrassment, but as Gingham composed himself, his accuracy improved, and by the end of his display, he was hitting each of the square targets with ease. He received respectful applause from the audience and even the judges, who then asked him some questions. Whilst Eugenia was rather nice to Gingham, Artulia and Rubius were much harsher with their questions, which left him lost for words on several occasions, but after appearing to be on the verge of a panic, Gingham stated that he was simply going to try and win, which confused the judges a little, but the audience applauded. He then scored 5-3-3, which gave him an overall score of 4. As per the reaping order, Organza was the final female tribute to be interviewed, and she received some of the strongest applause of the night when she entered the stage in an indigo dress of glowing sheer fabric, which she then ripped away to reveal a smaller violet dress that was embroidered in purple jewels. Before she could even speak, Eugenia stated that she wanted this dress, and Organza simply gave a nervous smile as the audience laughed. However, her chosen skill was not so impressive, and it simply saw Organza making some armour from a mixture of velvet and gauze, and once the allocated 3 minutes had passed, Rubius joked that she only had enough material to cover her elbow. The questioning was also tough on Organza, and she appeared to become quite sullen when Rubius asked how she would attempt to fight a tribute with a chainsaw, for example. She then received scores of 4-2-3, which scored her 3 overall. After Hancock received a respectful score of 5, Ava was welcomed to the stage by the judges. Eugenia began by stating how impressed she was with these tributes' outfits, which seemed to make Ava rather emotional, and she stated that there were some amazing minds in this group. Rubius then asked what she would like to see in the games, to which Ava bluntly responded, "No death." This mustered controversial laughter within the audience, and she quickly grinned at them, before stating that, come rain, shine, or anything else, she was sure her tributes would do themselves, their families, and District 8 proud. Once the tributes had awoken the next day, they were washed, dressed, and groomed for the games, before being taken to the roof of the building, and after a few minutes of nervously waiting and avoiding each other's gazes, the hovercraft landed and flew them to the arena. Whilst they were in their holding rooms, each tribute was dressed in a thin purple lycra bodysuit, along with black plimsolls, which appeared to displease many of the tributes, especially Rayon and Hancock, who asked if these suits came in a different colour. Ava visited each of the holding rooms in order to give some advice and words of encouragement to the tributes, whilst appearing more and more upset as she exited each room. By the time Ava entered the camera room, she appeared incapable of either speaking or stopping her tears, and as she watched the podiums rise into the cornucopia room, she turned an even paler shade of white. District 8's games took place in an arena known as the Forest Factory. This arena was the smallest so far of the district arenas, with a total radius of just under 500 metres from the centre of the arena to its circular perimeter. This central point was located within the cornucopia room, on the ground floor of an enormous hollow building, and just like the arena used by District 12's tributes 4 weeks prior, this was an exact replica of a former Capitol building. In the initial tour of the arena, Eugenia informed viewers that this building was based on an old import factory in the suburbs of the capital, to which the products and supplies from District 8 were imported and then constructed into clothing and furniture for the use of capital citizens. This factory boasted a height of 13 floors, along with an extremely long width of almost 250 metres, and although it was once a bustling powerhouse of production, all the walls and windows that lay within and on the outside of this building had since been ripped away. Although most of the floors were open plan and hence unobstructed from one end to the other, several alcoves were formed by the remaining brick walls on the building's southern side, where many useful objects were hidden, including scissors, sewing machines, mannequins, busts, mirrors, and wardrobes. They had been scattered throughout the floors, although many of these objects were now damp, rotten, and unable to serve their original purpose. The building also featured 2 stone stairways, approximately halfway along the western side and halfway along the eastern side, that led all the way from its ground floor to the 13th floor of the building. However, the banisters on these stairs had broken off a long time ago, and so there was nothing to stop tributes from falling off the sides of these stairways, which Rubius soon deemed to be a hidden hazard. It then came as somewhat of a surprise to viewers when Eugenia announced that the building only formed a small part of the arena, and that tributes were in fact allowed free rein of the forests beyond, although she swiftly added that they were obviously far too unkempt to be a replica of anything from the capital. Within these forests were many thick and bushy trees that were packed so densely together that it was impossible to see through the canopies that lay above, especially within the areas that immediately surrounded the main factory. Many small clearings, bushes, and even lakes were placed further into this forest, but most surprisingly to viewers and tributes alike were the various fabrics that hung from the top of some of the highest trees, which were difficult, yet not impossible to climb. Back in the centre of the building's ground floor, the podiums rose into a circle around the edge of a square, dingy room that was approximately only 20 metres long in both width and length. The room's walls were made of rotting bricks, but several large gaps had formed on all four walls, from the ceiling down to at least half of the wall's height, which enabled tributes to travel in and out of this room. In the very centre of the circle of podiums was a small brick platform with 4 large silver needles. Furthermore, within the space around this platform was a thick ring of fabrics that were made from a large variety of materials, colours, shapes and sizes. A few metres beyond, approximately halfway between the podiums and the central platform, were scraps of bread and cheese, along with a few small water bottles, although Eugenia stated that this seemed to be a much smaller amount of food than what was featured in the other district games. As the podiums entered the arena, most tributes appeared surprised by the brick wall that surrounded them, with Bernina shuddering as she looked behind her, whilst Rayon almost fell off his podium when he twisted around to peer through the nearest gap in the wall behind him. Net was stood on the northeastern side of the ring of podiums, and although most other tributes began to look away from the walls behind them and towards the supplies in front, she turned around. Then as the countdown began from 30, she seemed to be looking through a gap in the wall and then at the bricks on the edge of this gap. As for Bach, he was stood 2 podiums to the left of Net, on the other side of Chanel. He quickly scanned over the food, bottles and fabric that lay ahead, before casting his eye on the needles. Then as he looked left to see Lacey on the southern side and ahead to see Zig on the western side, the trio seemed to eye each other and share knowing looks before focusing on the supplies. As the countdown passed through 20 seconds, Lacey rubbed her hands over her arms, and Bach and Zig both clenched their fists, but after a while, Zig appeared to be eyeing Pelon, who was stood on the podium to his left and looking intently at the needles on the central platform. Organza was stood on the southern side, to the left of Lacey. She spent most of the countdown looking nervously ahead and back, with Eugenia stating in a later replay that she was obviously conflicted about running into or away from these supplies, especially when she appeared to see the ring of fabrics that lay before the needles. As for Gingham, he was stood on Lacey's other side. Of all the tributes, he seemed to be the most fearful, and as the countdown passed through 10 seconds, Rubius even exclaimed that Gingham may be about to vomit, but fortunately for him, he composed himself as the gong sounded just a few seconds later. Most tributes ran straight ahead, including Gingham, who grabbed a water bottle, but as he looked up, he seemed to panic as he watched several tributes running from all directions towards the central platform. He then grabbed a small bread roll as well, before twisting around and jumping through the gap in the wall behind him. He appeared to clip his foot on one of the jagged bricks, but despite wincing slightly, continued running on amidst the sounds of screams behind him. Meanwhile, Bach had run inwards, but unlike Gingham, he headed straight to the central platform. He and Zig appeared to notice each other running towards this platform, but as they ran across the different sides of the fabric ring, Bach noticed Synth was closing in on his left. He therefore punched Synth on the side of the head, which caused him to fall to the floor as Bach and Zig ran ahead. Just before Zig reached the platform a few seconds later, he noticed that Pelon was only a metre behind. Zig and Bach then grabbed a needle each, which caused Chanel, Rayon and Hancock to suddenly slow down and stop approaching. However, Pelon continued to the left of Zig, who suddenly put his left leg out, which caused Pelon to trip and fall straight onto the 2 remaining needles, thereby impaling his neck and then his only eye. Meanwhile, Organza had also run in from the south, but instead of aiming for the needles like most of the other tributes that had run in, she quickly grabbed some green latex and orange lame scraps that lay in front of her. Hancock nearly trod on these materials as he jumped back from the central platform, and Organza appeared ready to take them and run, but just as she looked back towards the food and water, she was kicked in the face by Lacey, which caused her to fall onto her side. Lacey quickly knelt down and smacked Organza's head into the floor, yet both girls seemed surprised by how little this appeared to hurt Organza, due to a layer of fluffy pink tulle that lay beneath and hence softened the impact of her head against the ground. Organza then punched Lacey in the right breast, which made her yelp, and Organza tried to scurry to her feet, yet before she could move, Bach appeared to notice what had just happened to Lacey, and he pulled Pelon's head back off the 2 needles, before throwing one for Lacey and letting Pelon fall to the ground. Lacey quickly caught it, and just as Organza was beginning to run, she stabbed this needle into her leg, which caused her to shriek and fall, whilst Bernina then tripped backwards on a water bottle on the western side As she scurried away from Zig, Lacey stabbed this needle several times into Organza's neck, whilst appearing to grimace at the amount of blood that was flying out onto her and the surrounding fabric. After stabbing Organza's neck a total of 7 times, Lacey turned around to see Zig finally overpowering Bernina, who had put up a surprisingly strong defense against Zig's needle with her bare hands. Lacey then looked all around her, and while most tributes were fleeing from the cornucopia room with whatever supplies they could carry, she watched Bark chasing Rayon towards a large gap in the northeastern wall. During this time, Net had immediately run away from the supplies towards the large gap in the northeastern wall that lay behind her. After climbing through this gap, she watched as Velveteen quickly followed behind her, but the girls did not seem interested in attacking each other, and Velveteen ran on. Net then raised her head just high enough above the wall to see Bark pushing Pellon's head down onto the needles on the central platform, and after briefly wincing in horror at the other deaths that soon began to occur, she began to examine the brick wall over which she had just jumped. Net noticed a brick that seemed slightly loose, and whilst checking that no other tributes could see her, she gripped onto this brick and tried to pull, but to no avail. Almost a minute went by, and she started to loosen this brick slightly, until a large thud was heard on the other side of the wall. Viewers saw that Rayon had tripped and fallen against this wall after being chased by Bark, who proceeded to stab Rayon in the neck with this needle. However, he did this with such force that the brick behind his head, which Net had been trying to take, suddenly loosened. Net grabbed this brick and scurried to her feet, whilst Bark heard her, and he swiped his needle towards her head. But Net threw herself back and missed the needle by a few inches, before running ahead with his brick in hand. Bark appeared tempted to chase Net, but after turning around and noticing that Lacey was still holding her chest in pain, and Zig was already pocketing some of the few remaining food supplies, he appeared to think that it was best to stay with his allies for now. While shouts and screams were heard from the fleeing tributes, Lacey suggested that they gather the bread, cheese and water, then search for the nearest tributes. Neither of the boys appeared to have an issue with this plan, and while Zig picked up the few bread rolls and hunks of cheese that remained, Bark pulled the needle from Pellon's eye. Upon a closer inspection, Lacey found a few small shoulder bags within the ring of fabric, and Bark suggested that they use these to carry the food and water, and within a minute, the only remaining supplies on the floor were those within the ring of fabric. Yet just as Zig asked which way Bark and Lacey would like to travel, a loud coughing sound was heard to their east. The trio quickly jumped through the gap on the western wall, and although they quickly noticed Ola, who was struggling to walk, just meters from the eastern stairway, they also seemed shocked and amazed by the leafy trees and grass that lay beyond the southern edge of the building. However, Lacey ran ahead towards Ola, and this seemed to bring the boys' attention back. Ola heard the trio, who were now just 40 meters away, and she rapidly turned around and began to climb these stairs, although she was clearly struggling to do this without the support of banisters. Lacey led the pack as they ran towards this stairway, which appeared to panic Ola, and just as she was hurrying to the top of these stone stairs, she lost her balance and tripped, before falling backwards down the stairs and smacking her head as she hit the floor. The boys then watched as Lacey walked towards Ola, who was now shaking, and she stabbed her in the neck several times until she finally stopped moving, at which point 5 cannons sounded. Meanwhile, Gingham had run away from the cornucopia room, and whilst most other tributes were fleeing up the stairways, he ran towards the southern edge of this building, as the sound of the first deaths occurred behind him. Gingham soon reached the edge of the forests, and like several other tributes from this district, he marvelled at the texture of these trees and their branches. Eugenia then asked if he had never seen a tree before, but Rubius responded that when he had last visited District 8, he did not remember seeing any trees or even grass. As the screams and shouts echoed within the building behind Gingham, he continued south, and spent the next 2 minutes running through the forest, whilst appearing to look around and wonder at all the different trees. He almost ran into one, just 300 meters south of the building, before catching his breath and sipping from his water bottle, as the first of the 5 cannons sounded. Before the last of them had even sounded, Gingham was already continuing south, although he soon appeared to notice that the ground was rising very rapidly. He looked around a little, but after noticing that there were no other tributes in the vicinity, he rested on the ground and looked out into the distance at the building, from which he was almost level with the 3rd and 4th floor. For the next hour, Gingham watched carefully as Hancock, Therma, Chanel, Jacquard, and Synth ran up through each floor, whilst looking for whatever useful supplies or weapons they could find. Yet after a minute of feeling the bark of the nearest tree, Gingham jolted back to look at the building when he heard panicked shouting that was swiftly followed by the sight of heavy, white gas flowing from the open sides of the fourth floor. After Ola's death, Lacey, Bark and Zig carefully headed up the stairs from the first to the second floor. They each seemed amazed once more, this time by the large space and nature of the sparsely placed objects. Zig asked if there could be any tributes hiding on this floor, and so Bark suggested that they look together. For the next 20 minutes, they carefully moved between each of the 40 horizontal alcoves on the southern side, whilst checking inside each wardrobe, behind each mirror, and beneath each pile of rags for other tributes, but without finding any. Yet around the time they had finished checking the most western of the alcoves, they heard what sounded like shouting coming from a higher floor. After Synth had accidentally made Chenille jump and scream, then Bark stated that they needed to move on up. The trio continued to the third floor, and for 20 minutes they also searched here, but still with no success. Yet just as they were moving past the very middle of the floor, Lacey suddenly noticed a button that she claimed to look like an old fire alarm, which was placed at the top of the northern wall. Zig at first thought nothing of it, and said that they should continue, but Bark argued that there was nothing to lose by pressing it, and that it could help them against other tributes. Although Zig still voiced his reservations to pressing this button, he helped Lacey onto Bark's shoulders, and they moved towards this button. Then, after taking a few deep breaths, Lacey pressed it. At first, nothing appeared to happen, and Zig stated that this button was indeed useless, but after just a few seconds, all three tributes appeared to hear a hissing sound coming from the floor above them. They walked towards the southern side of the third floor, and after almost 20 seconds, they were able to spot the thick, heavy gas flowing out of the southern side of the fourth floor. Confused shouts were then heard from several floors above, as the other group noticed the remnants of this gas rising towards them, and Bark grinned, before telling Lacey and Zig that they needed to head on up. Meanwhile, Net had run deep into the forest, and she was now resting near the northeast perimeter, although she did not appear too fazed or shocked by the forest, with Ruby suggesting that her practice in the plant station during training had probably accustomed her to plants and trees. Like Gingham and several other tributes that were now in the forests, Net noticed the gas that was flowing out of the fourth floor. She also looked up to see the other 5 tributes, who were panicking and spluttering as some of this gas reached all the way to the 8th floor, where they were stood. Yet as they quickly headed to the 9th floor, Net watched carefully and remained completely still, whilst gripping the brick in her hand. Meanwhile, back in the building, Bark, Zig and Lacey ran up to the 4th floor, where some of the gas was still lingering, and Zig coughed profusely for a few seconds, although after covering his mouth with some of the fabric that they had taken from the cornucopia room, he seemed to recover. The group spent the next few minutes looking along this floor for any other tributes, but after failing to find any, they agreed to press the button on the wall, which they correctly guessed to activate the gas on the 5th floor above. Lacey once again pressed it with the help of Bark, and as the hissing rolled over the floor above them, Zig took some of the water and poured it on the fabric that he had placed over his mouth, before suggesting to the others that they did the same with the other pieces of fabric, in order to assist their breathing. Bark and Lacey followed suit, and wrapped the fabric around their necks and mouths, then headed up to the 5th floor. For the next 15 minutes, the trio continued to push the buttons that activated the gas on the 6th, 7th, and 8th floor, during which time Jacquard continued to have trouble breathing, and he died after inhaling too much of this gas. However, the rest of this group continued upwards, until they reached the 13th floor, at which point they panicked as they realized that Bark, Lacey, and Zig were still following them from beneath, and that the stairway did not lead onto the roof. Over the next 15 minutes, the trio continued all the way to the 11th floor, where they activated the gas for the 12th floor. Even though the other group were 1 floor above, they still inhaled some of the smoke, which caused Synth to cough uncontrollably, and Therma began to cry. Whilst Bark, Zig, and Lacey were searching through the floor below, Hancock stated that they would die if they remained on this floor, and that they needed to go onto the roof. Chenille frantically responded that the stairs did not lead to the roof, but Hancock pointed to the ceiling at the side of the building, before saying that this was the only way. Although Therma shouted that she was scared of heights, Hancock walked over to the side of the building and said that if they got on his shoulders, they should be able to reach the roof above. Therma voiced her concern again, but Chenille said that it was either this or the gas. Viewers in Snow Square then held their breath as Synth held onto the back of Hancock, who lifted Chenille up at the very edge of the floor. After almost a minute of nervous silence and shallow breathing, Chenille had just about pushed herself up onto the roof, and Hancock helped Synth next. This was slightly easier, due to Chenille already being on the roof, and Synth was soon helped up. Yet just as Hancock was trying to reassure Therma, who was still weeping that she was scared of heights, the gas suddenly flew out of the vents by the stairways. Therma began to panic even more as the gas approached, but Hancock grabbed her by the arms, and without even listening to her screams, he forced her high enough for her hands to be grabbed by Chenille and Synth. As the gas came nearer, Therma almost slipped and she screamed, but was eventually dragged up by Chenille and Synth. They then held their hands down to Hancock and shouted at him to come up, but he gave a sympathetic smile before shouting obscenities to President Gall and the Capitol, and then performing a three-finger salute. Chenille started to scream at Hancock to come up, but he threw himself forwards from the building and hit the ground a few seconds later, which sounded his cannon. Over the next few minutes, the gas cleared from the side of the building, and Lacey led the way up to the 13th floor, but they were extremely surprised to not find the other tributes. The trio even hunted through the floor and discussed where they could be, when they were in fact sat on the roof above them. However, after another check and realizing that this floor was indeed empty, the trio moved down to the 6th floor, where they rested for the next hour and fanned themselves from the intense heat that began to enter the arena. Meanwhile, Gingham had remained in the southern forest, where he watched with interest as the commotion occurred on the top floor of the building. After a while, he began to walk further up the hill towards the southern perimeter, but he was drinking more and more water during this time, and after just 5 minutes, he remarked that it was boiling. Whilst other tributes also appeared to sense this heat, Eugenia informed viewers that the temperature had indeed been raised to 48 degrees Celsius, to which Rubius responded that it would be interesting to see how the tributes dealt with this change. Gingham was fortunate to still have some of his water, and he drank from it sparingly, while sitting in the shade behind a tree and continuing to keep watch for any passing tributes. Although this seemed to help, he was clearly still too hot, and he unzipped the top of his lycra suit, which appeared to cool him down to some degree over the next hour. As for Nett, she also seemed to sense the heat, and at first remained where she was. Yet after a while of fanning herself, and still finding this temperature unbearable, she became restless, and cautiously looked towards the building to her south. She appeared to think carefully for the next minute, then got up and headed south. Nett walked quickly, yet carefully, and looked around and above as she travelled to the building. She also seemed confused by a large brown object hanging from the top of a tree, that Eugenia announced to be a thick fur coat, although Rubius responded that this was the last thing she would need right now. Nett appeared to make a mental note of this coat's location, before continuing south until she reached the northern side of the building. She cautiously looked around for other tributes, but after realizing that she could not see or hear any, she sprinted to the building's eastern side, before carefully walking south with her back against the eastern wall until she reached the southeastern corner of the building, at which point she looked out and appeared relieved to see nobody stood on the ground in front of the building. However, just as Nett was about to run inside, she looked up and appeared to notice the sleeve of a bright red shirt that Zig had inadvertently left to hang over the side of the building after it had proved to be ineffective as a fan against the heat. Nett looked carefully at this sleeve before sprinting to the west for the next minute until she was stood directly beneath these tributes. Nett listened and looked up, and she soon began to hear the voices of Lacey and Bark, who were discussing where the other tributes could be. Whilst she listened, Zig dropped an empty water bottle off the side of the building that hit Nett on the head, but she quickly covered her mouth and hence remained quiet, then ran into the building and immediately appeared to appreciate the shade that this building offered. Over the next few minutes, Nett very slowly headed onto the 2nd floor and looked around for supplies, but failed to find anything useful. She also seemed timid about exploring the entirety of the floor, and she therefore ascended to the 3rd and 4th floor, which she explored carefully before heading up to the 5th floor, where she cautiously rested. Whilst continually looking into the southern forest, presumably for any other tributes, Nett quietly walked to a central alcove, from which she could see the red sleeve hanging over the side of the floor above, and as she listened carefully, she also heard the voices of these tributes on the floor above. Nett looked around the surrounding alcoves, and she noticed a mannequin and a small pile of tattered rags that lay in front of a large wooden wardrobe. After appearing to say something to herself, Nett placed the mannequin within the pile of rags, and over the next 10 minutes she quietly gathered all the other rags she could find from all over this floor, which she placed over the mannequin, in order to form a much larger pile that seemed to have an almost human shape. After breathing out for a few seconds and closing her eyes, Net smacked her brick against the nearest wall, which caused a loud cracking sound, and the trio above were immediately alerted. She heard Bark excitedly saying that someone was on the floor below, and as he hurried Zig and Lacey to run down to this floor with him, Net quietly slid into the wardrobe next to the pile of rags, before almost completely closing the door. Viewers in Snow Square shouted with excitement as Bark, Lacey and Zig ran down to the 5th floor and then west from the eastern stairway towards the alcove in which Net was now hiding. Through the camera that was just able to see her through the gap in the wardrobe doors, she appeared to be breathing deeply as the trio came closer, before grasping her hand over her mouth when they were in the adjacent alcove, although just as Bark said that they needed to check this area of the floor, running was heard from the western stairway. It was shown to viewers that Velveteen had been ascending through this building, but upon seeing Bark, Lacey and Zig, she sprinted back down the stairs. As Bark ran towards the western stairway, he told Lacey and Zig to check this area, as Velveteen ran down the western stairway. Lacey and Zig nodded in agreement, and they each searched through this alcove, with their needles held firmly at the ready, but with no results. Zig then seemed to become quite bored, and stood at the very edge of the floor, before spitting over the edge. Lacey sharply ordered him to focus, and she reminded him that they needed to look for whatever or whoever had caused the sound. He nonchalantly apologized, and Lacey told him to check the next alcove to the west, and that she would check the one afterwards, where viewers could see that Net was hiding. Zig did as Lacey asked, and he looked with interest at an old sewing machine that lay on one of the tables, whilst Lacey entered the next alcove, where she was clearly surprised to see what looked like a person in the pile of rags in front of the wardrobe. She looked curiously at the pile and slowly approached it, before crouching down and holding her head above the head of the mannequin. Zig continued to look within the wardrobe at the next alcove, then he looked towards the southern forests, whilst Lacey stabbed the needle down onto the mannequin's head, and viewers saw Net very gently opening the wardrobe door behind her. Lacey then appeared confused, until she realised that this was in fact a mannequin, but just as the suspicion was seen in her eyes, Net jumped forwards and shoved Lacey onto the pile of rags, before smacking her on the back of the head with the brick. Lacey thrashed her arms around and yelped, but the latter sound was muffled by the rags beneath her mouth, and hence was not heard. Lacey tried to turn and hit Net with the needle, but Net hit Lacey with the brick again, with such force that she started bleeding, and became almost still. Net then grabbed the needle from Lacey's limp hand and stabbed it into the side of her neck, before very quietly getting back up and climbing into the wardrobe. Shocked viewers in Snow Square watched on the split screen as Zig looked around aimlessly in the adjacent alcove, until he suddenly called out for Lacey, who did not reply. He then very carefully turned the corner, but gasped when he saw that she was struggling to breathe on the pile of rags. Zig ran towards Lacey, who was still barely conscious, but as she tried to point towards the wardrobe, Zig grabbed her hand and asked what had happened. Yet before Lacey could even reply, Net had pushed the door ever so slightly, which gave her enough space to throw this needle between the doors and straight at Zig's neck. For a split second, he looked down in confusion as his blood splattered all over Lacey, who was still bleeding beneath him, but Net then burst open the wardrobe doors and jumped out, at which point Zig began to cough blood. He tried to raise his needle towards Net, but she stepped forwards and kicked Zig in the face with enough force to cause him to fall backwards, and as he lay bleeding on the floor, she stabbed the needle down into his neck once more. Over the next minute, 2 cannons sounded, and Net took Zig's needle and water, along with Lacey's bread, before running back towards the eastern stairway and waiting on the 3rd floor, where she hid behind a large bust for the next 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Bark had chased Velveteen down the western stairway, but she ran surprisingly quickly, and as she sprinted into the southern forest, he seemed to think that it was not worth leaving Lacey and Zig. Yet as their cannons sounded, Bark appeared extremely panicked and swore in frustration, before running into the building and towards the western stairway that he had used earlier. Net continued to wait behind the bust as she heard Bark running up through this building and past the 3rd floor. As the hovercraft entered the arena, he reached the 5th floor, where the Deathclaw was collecting Zig and Lacey's bodies, and he shouted in fury, then looked over the southern side of the building to see Net running out of the 1st floor's southern side, and he glared at her with a vengeful expression as she vanished into the forest. However, Net did not seem to realise that she had been seen, and she continued to run through the southern forest, which was not as hot as it had been earlier. She drank some water, and rested whilst Horn and Penty played, and the portraits of Rayon, aged 16, Bernina, aged 14, Lacey, aged 17, Jacquard, aged 15, Sig, aged 18, Ola, aged 15, Pellon, aged 15, Organza, aged 14, and Hancock, aged 18 were all shown, which left only Net, aged 17, Bark, aged 18, Synth, aged 17, Chenille, aged 18, Therma, aged 17, Velveteen, aged 13, and Gingham, aged 12, remaining. For the next half hour, most tributes did not move, and they seemed to appreciate the arena's cooler temperatures that had followed the earlier heatwave. Net remained deep in the southeastern forest, whilst Velveteen and Gingham were in fact surprisingly close to each other in the southwestern forest, with Rubeus theorising what would happen if this pair encountered each other. As for Bark, he continued to look out to the south from the 5th floor of the building, while Synth, Chenille, and Therma had come out from the shade of the roof shelters due to the temperatures that were now bearable. However, as this time went on, some tributes, but especially Gingham, voiced their concerns that the temperature was in fact dropping to a lower level than it had been before the heatwave. In fact, Velveteen soon began to shiver, whilst Net seemed to be looking curiously at the sky that just turned white, and even on top of the building, Therma remarked that the roof beneath their feet was icy cold. Rubeus then sniggered as snow began to pour from the arena's roof, and within 10 minutes, a blizzard was lashing through the arena. As the blizzard intensified, Bark appeared to be in two minds about whether he should leave the building, but as he looked into the forest, he incorrectly stated that he could see someone moving. Bark ruffled through the pile of clothes on top of the mannequin that Net had placed, before finding two thick white shawls, which he quickly glued together after finding a glue gun in the next alcove. He then readied his needle and supplies, before hastily heading down the western stairway, whilst the cold winds of the blizzard lashed into the building. Meanwhile, Gingham seemed to be feeling the cold mostly on his neck, and Rubeus joked that he probably wished he had not cut his hair. Gingham also struggled to zip up his lycra suit, after he had opened it earlier, which caused his upper back to turn a light blue colour, and he continued to shiver. As Bark entered the forest south of the building, Gingham finally seemed to decide that he needed to move, and he slowly got to his feet, whilst examining his hands that had now turned purple. He staggered north for the next few minutes, before collapsing on the ground and shaking, just 100 metres in front of the southwestern side of the building. Yet as Gingham fell, Bark was walking to the west along the building's southern side, and as Gingham tried to get back up, Bark spotted him, then jumped behind a nearby tree with his needle at the ready. Eugenia said that ironically, it would be best for Gingham to stay where he was, but much to the annoyance of his supporters in Snow Square, he got to his feet, and continued to trudge on through the snowy winds that were now lashing his face, whilst Bark waited with the needle held firmly in his hand. Almost a minute passed, and Gingham finally limped past Bark to the edge of the forest, but due to the cold winds and Gingham's likely desire to enter the building ahead, he failed to notice Bark until he had run out from behind this tree and was heading towards Gingham with the needle. Bark almost managed to stab Gingham's neck, but he noticed Bark at the final second, before yelping and throwing himself back. As the crowds cheered in Snow Square, Bark pushed into Gingham and knocked him to the ground. Bark thrust the needle down towards Gingham's heart, but he managed to push himself to the left, and only received a cut on his right chest, although this made him yelp in pain. Bark then raised his arm to bring down the needle again, but Gingham kicked Bark's knee and pushed himself away. Bark winced in pain, but lunged towards Gingham, before lying almost on top of him. Gingham then gritted his teeth with determination, whilst desperately holding Bark's arm away. Yet after 7 seconds, Gingham finally ran out of strength, and Bark managed to stab him in the heart, at first lightly, but as Gingham shouted in pain, Bark stabbed him much harder, and blood spattered onto Bark's white shawl, as Gingham stopped moving. Bark looked at Gingham in disbelief, then got to his feet as his cannon sounded. The hovercraft then entered, and Bark trudged away to the east for the next 2 minutes, before sheltering in a small clearing near the centre of the building's southern side. Meanwhile, Net was clearly feeling the cold, but after she began to shiver, she stood up and headed north, along the eastern side of the arena. As she walked, Rubeus asked if she was trying to hide again, but Eugenia responded that maybe she was looking for the fur coat at the top of the tree that she had seen earlier. Shortly after Gingham's cannon sounded, this theory was proved to be correct, where Net seemed to navigate herself between various trees and paths of this sector, before smiling as she looked up to see the coat blowing in the winds at the top of a nearby tree. Net mounted the bottom of the tree and gradually climbed its branches, although she slipped and fell after just a few seconds. She stretched her right foot, on which she had just fallen, and then climbed the tree again. However, this time she moved much more slowly, which eventually allowed her to reach a thick branch near the top of the tree, upon which she rested for a while. Net continued climbing until her hand was just a meter away from the coat, at which point she was hit in the face by a flurry of cold air and the branch broke beneath her right foot. But Net held on to the tree with her other hand, and after practically hopping to the next branch above, she managed to grab the bottom of the coat, which caused it to fall to the ground below. Although she was clearly elated, Net very carefully climbed down the tree, before jumping onto the ground and throwing the fur coat around herself, whilst applause and cheers were heard in Snow Square. For the next half hour, Net held the needles at the ready in the side pockets of her coat, while slowly walking south through the blizzard, along the eastern side of the building. After almost 15 minutes, she passed a tree that held a large black blanket in its higher branches, which lay less than 50 meters to the north of her previous resting spot. She looked at it pensively, then scurried into a nearby clearing and ripped off some snow-covered branches. Net lay down on the ground beneath the foliage of these branches for the next 20 minutes, but just as it seemed like she may be about to fall asleep, she suddenly heard the voices of Therma and Synth, who were arguing just 20 meters to her south. Net very carefully looked out through the snowy bushes of the clearing in which she was resting, as this pair trudged through the snow, and she grinned when Synth spotted the blanket in the tree above. He and Therma then argued about which of them should climb the tree for this blanket, whilst Net held her needles at the ready. After a lively discussion, Synth eventually agreed to climb the tree, and as he mounted the first few branches, Therma watched and shivered by the tree's base, amidst continuing snowfall. She tried to encourage Synth by telling him that they might freeze to death if they did not access this blanket, but as he climbed into the middle height of this tree, he stated that this was not helping. Whilst Therma then shouted back that she was cold and did not want to die, Net very carefully got to her feet, with her needles at the ready. An argument ensued between the pair once more, and Therma appeared far too distracted to notice that Net was walking up behind her, while Synth was looking away, towards the blanket that lay just a few branches above. It was only when his hand was just a meter away from the bottom of the blanket that he finally looked down, to see Net mere steps behind Therma, who was now bent over with cold. Viewers in Snow Square shouted with excitement, but after Synth noticed Net, he said nothing to Therma, and she obliviously looked back up to him. Net then stabbed Therma in both sides of the neck with her needles, and she almost immediately fell to the floor between two forming piles of blood. Synth seemed worried as he looked down at Net, but she simply checked Therma's empty pockets, before looking back up at Synth as Therma's cannon sounded, and then she walked off to the west. Synth managed to grab the blanket a minute later, but he very carefully waited in the tree and only came down after 5 minutes, when he seemed convinced that Net was no longer in the vicinity. Over the next hour, the darkness of night set in, but the blizzard soon relaxed, and the warmer temperatures that followed melted a lot of the snow that had settled within the forest. Yet whilst most of the surviving tributes rested within clearings of the forest, another cannon sounded, which was shown to viewers to belong to Velveteen. Although the temperature had finally risen, she had already been suffering with the effects of hypothermia, having even removed her lycra suit in the minutes before her death, which caused confusion amongst Capital viewers. Minutes after Velveteen's brittle and barely clothed body was removed from the arena, Horn of Plenty played once more, and the portraits of Therma, aged 17, Velveteen, aged 13, and Gingham, aged 12, were shown, which left only Net, aged 17, Bark, aged 18, Synth, aged 17, and Chenille, aged 18, as the 4 remaining tributes. Within the 10 minutes following the anthem, Eugenia remarked how strange it was that none of the tributes had yet re-entered the building, but Rubius replied that they were most likely worried that other tributes were already there and lying in wait. A quick analysis was performed to show that Synth was about to fall asleep in the southeastern sector of the forest, whilst Bark was still resting in a clearing very close to the building's central southern side. Net was now eating some bread in a western clearing, and Chenille was approximately 200 meters to her south. Eugenia and Rubius then began to discuss what may happen with only 4 tributes remaining, but before a minute of their conversation had even gone by, a flurry of high-pitched squawks was heard, and Rubius quickly reordered the camera to refocus on the arena. A ghastly yell followed, and seconds later, a cannon sounded. Over the next minute, citizens in Snow Square clamoured to find out who had just died, and Eugenia announced that Buck Berjac was the male victor of District 8's games, and that any physical harm towards him would result in a detonated tracker. As more of these squawks were heard within the southern ends of the arena, the split screen showed Chenille and Net simultaneously running north towards the building through the darkness of the forest, and even though he had just been announced as the male victor, Bark was desperately running west towards the building's southwestern corner. Net soon became the first to re-enter the building's ground floor, and as she seemed to spot Bark running along the southern side of the building, she sprinted to the western stairway, before running up to the second floor and heading to the southern side, where she hid behind a wardrobe and looked south into the forests below. It was then that Net appeared to see Chenille, who was now running through the last 100 meters south of the building. But as Net readied her needles and breathed deeply, she appeared shocked to hear Bark whispering to Chenille and trying to capture her attention. At first, Chenille was clearly alarmed to see Bark running towards her, but he whispered that Net had gone up the western stairway, and Chenille thanked him for this information. However, upon realizing that she was now going to be facing 2 tributes instead of just 1, Net was heard to swear under her breath before running back to the western stairway. She managed to run up to the 3rd floor, just seconds before Chenille and Bark arrived on the 2nd floor. She then listened carefully through the gap in the stairway as Bark told Chenille about the gas button that affected the floor above each button, to which Chenille replied in an annoyed tone that she knew very well about this, and Bark made a brief apology for having killed her allies. Yet neither Bark nor Chenille appeared to realize that Net had also heard this explanation, and as Bark and Chenille ran to the button at the middle of the 2nd floor, Net sprinted towards a southern alcove that lay just to the east of the 3rd floor's centre. Within 2 minutes, Bark had managed to place Chenille on his shoulders, and she pressed the button, which caused the gas to flow onto the 3rd floor. As it moved towards Net, she held her head over the side of the building and carefully covered her mouth and eyes with her fur coat, which appeared to stop her from inhaling this gas. However, as the gas cloud moved beyond this floor, Net suddenly heard Bark and Chenille running up the eastern stairway towards this floor. Fortunately for Net, they could not see her, as she was lying next to a wall that separated this alcove, but as she began to hear Chenille asking where she was, Net breathed in gently, before turning around and lowering herself over the edge of the building, from which she held on with her hands and dangled her feet over the side, whilst whispering to herself to not look down. Net then heard Chenille and Bark running around the floor and looking for her, so she began to swing herself back and forth beneath the 3rd floor, and after a few movements, she threw herself onto the 2nd floor. She ripped off a leg from the nearest mannequin, then ran towards the gas button on the northern wall, as Rubius stated that Net may have just won now. Chenille and Bark incorrectly guessed that Net had proceeded up to the 4th floor, and they began to walk to the eastern stairway. During the next minute, Net heard their voices moving east across the floor above, and she waited for almost 20 seconds before running up the wall beneath the button and hitting the button with the mannequin leg. Although she proceeded to land in a heap on her fur coat, the button had indeed been hit, and she then sprinted east, with both needles in hand, as the gas began to flow from the vents on the floor above, straight towards Chenille and Bark. The pair began to splutter and rub their eyes as Net neared the stairway, and she quickly ascended the stairs, whilst hearing Chenille shout for Bark. Net covered her mouth with the coat once more as she ran through the gas and across the 3rd floor, towards the sound of Chenille's whimpers. It was only when Net was a few meters away that Chenille was finally able to see her through the smoke, and Net pounced onto Chenille before simultaneously stabbing both sides of her neck with the needles, which made her cough out blood and fall to the floor. The smoke rapidly began to clear, and Bark suddenly ran towards the girls, but as Net thrust a needle into Chenille's heart, he appeared to realize that it was too late to stop Net, and after a few seconds a cannon sounded, before Net Charles was announced to be the female victor of District 8's games, and unlike the previous games, it was added that she too could not be physically harmed. Over the next minute, the gas completely cleared, and Bark snarled at Net, who removed her fur coat and lay down upon it, before looking with a concerned expression at Bark. He asked if she had killed Lacey and Zig, to which she reluctantly nodded, before adding that it was nothing personal. The pair then continued to have a rather tense conversation until the hovercraft entered and collected them from the arena. Following their removal from the arena, Bach and Net were flown straight to Gaul Hospital, where they were given physical and psychological examinations, which confirmed that they were both in good health. The pair then slept at the hospital that night as a precaution, before being returned to the accommodation tower the next morning, where they were left to their own devices until the afternoon, when the AVOX team of stylists came to prepare them for the victor interviews that evening. Net was adorned in a bright purple dress, which featured small needles all over its shoulders and arms, which paid homage to her victory method. As for Bach, he was dressed in a suit of a matching colour, but upon a closer inspection, it was revealed to be made of a substance similar to a tree's bark. Although Net and Bach had allegedly argued backstage before the interviews, they put on an adequately united front, as Eugenia asked them about their differing experiences within the games. However, it was noticed by some eagle-eyed viewers upon a rewatch that following various responses, several strange looks were given by these victors towards each other. When Net was asked about her surprisingly strong use of needles, she responded that due to the higher probability of being reaped for the games this year, she and her sisters had been practicing throwing needles at targets since the district games began 5 weeks earlier. However, Net then added that she had not wished to make her skills too obvious to other tributes, as this would likely make her a target in their eyes. As for Bach, Eugenia praised him for his ability to keep Zig and Lacey in line, before asking him if he would have killed Zig when the time came, but Bach responded that he was planning to kill Zig soon after Net killed him, as he was becoming a liability. A review was then played on the screen which showed Net eyeing the red sleeve from below, which made Bach shake his head in disbelief as the audience laughed. Yet as Net gave a comedically guilty expression, Bach nodded and said that this was fair enough. For the next 2 days, Net and Bach stayed in the capital, where they were invited to many important events. In fact, during the after-party for these interviews, Net was introduced to Coriolanus Snow III, with whom she built a strong relationship over the next 2 days, and she is even alleged to have slept at Snow Manor both these nights. As for Bach, he is rumoured to have been offered his first dose of morphling during this after-party, which led to him spending most of the next 2 days under the influence of this drug. His mentor, Ava Berrick, was allegedly furious about Bach's sudden addiction, which caused several arguments between the pair during their stay in the capital. However, in the early hours of Saturday, 3 days after the games, disaster struck in the form of the infamous AVOX escape, which saw several AVOXes and undercover members of Unidad launching a surprise attack on the peacekeepers that were guarding 21 hovercraft within Ravenstal Airport, in the outskirts of the city. This attack unfortunately led to most of these peacekeepers being mercilessly killed, and these rebels commandeered the craft, which they flew to the centre of the capital. Later investigations revealed that this plot had been planned for some time within these communities as a way to weaken and strain capital resources, and that the vast majority of the city's 1,916 AVOXes had been coerced to be present in Snow Square at 4 o'clock that morning. Capital forces were able to stop some of these AVOXes from reaching Snow Square, but many of the hovercraft that were now controlled by rebels were used to target these forces, which unfortunately led to most of the AVOXes reaching Snow Square. Only one of these hovercraft was subsequently shot down, whilst the rest landed in Snow Square shortly after. A total of 1,566 AVOXes were then abducted onto the craft, which flew east, until they were reported to have arrived in Germania that evening. Following these tragic events, the capital was temporarily thrown into chaos, whilst Bach and Net were taken back to District 8, several days earlier than planned. However, thanks to the strong and stable leadership that was exercised by President Gall, citizens of the capital soon managed to adjust to life without their AVOXes, and order was restored. The day before District 7's games, a televised ceremony was broadcast throughout Panem, which showed the executions of all the remaining AVOXes, except for those in the tribute's team of stylists. Upon returning to District 8, Bach moved into a house in the victor's village with his parents and younger brother, Gorza. Unfortunately, it is alleged that he continued to consume copious amounts of alcohol and morphling during this time, which caused his girlfriend, Luma, to end their relationship, whilst he is not reported to have trained at all for the grand final that followed. As for Net, she moved into a house in the victor's village with her father and younger sisters, where she is said to have lived a peaceful few weeks, designing many different types of clothes that she claimed to want to make while she still had time. Letters of a romantic nature that were written between Ned and Coriolanus Snow III during this time were later recovered, which show that she promised to live with him in the capital if she managed to survive the grand final. Many diplomatic efforts were made between President Gaul and the Germanian government in order to have the abducted Avoxes sent back to Panem, but these efforts ultimately proved fruitless. Although it is not certain what happened to these Avoxes, many accounts state that they were given Germanian citizenship, while some even had prosthetic tongues fitted, which afforded them the power of speech. Many of the younger Avoxes also went on to have families, the descendants of whom are rumoured to live in Germania to this day.